to hit the record. That's one of the things all these technical little things, I usually forget to do something, but didn't forget it today. So hi, everybody who's jumping in right now. I'm going to give Facebook a minute or two to let everybody know that we're here and that we're live. So I'll fill a little bit of airtime talking about Warwick's and how everybody can participate tonight. And if you're here with us right this minute and you need to leave, no fear. This conversation will stay on Facebook. You can come back to it and see it. And I'll put notes in the comment section too, that people, if they jump in late, they can go back and watch at the beginning too. So a little bit about Warwick's for those that may be seeing us from outside of the San Diego area. I'm hoping that if you are joining us from San Diego, that you know about Warwick's. We are a little bit of a legacy down here. We're going to be celebrating, and we're going to be sending to you too. We're celebrating our 125th year this year.
Wow.
Yeah. And well, we're not the oldest store in the country. We're the oldest continuously family owned. So Nancy Warwick is the 4th generation owner of Warwick. So yeah, kind of a big deal. So we're going to play. Yeah, it's a very big deal, right? I mean, it's and we've weathered many storms, the pandemic being only one of them. So in 125 years, there was a lot of stuff that happened that that the Warwick's family has survived. So it's a great legacy to be a part of. Lacy, we're going to be having a party. Carol, you're welcome down too. We're going to start planning that. It's going to be in November sometime. So we think that by then everybody will be able to be out and about and mingling. So look for that. And if not, we'll have a virtual guest book for you all to sign. So anyways, that's enough about that. We are open for business now, masks, social distancing. If you are in the San Diego, La Jolla area, please come by the store. There's nothing like shopping for books in person, buying those big stacks. We also have another side of the store that just has wonderful gifts and jewelry and all kinds of fun stuff. So it's a great place to come have lunch in La Jolla and spend the day with us. There's ways for you to participate tonight. I'll be putting Carol and Lacy's book into the comment section, so you can easily click on that. And if you want to come pick it up at the store, you can choose that. If you want a signed book, put that in the notes field. And if you want it personalized, put that in the notes field too, because Carol will be able to get us some personalized book plates if needed. So when you order the book, please do that. Ways for you to participate tonight is you can go ahead and put your questions into the comment section. We won't be bringing those in live. Lacy and Carol are going to chat for about 35-ish minutes, something like that. And then I'll bring in any questions to them after they're done with their conversation. So I think Facebook's had enough time to let everybody know that we're here. So let's get the show on the road here. So Carol Edgarian is the author of the New York Times bestseller, 3 Stages of Amazement, and the international bestseller, Rise the Euphrates, winner of the ANC Freedom Prize. Her articles and essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal and W, among many others. She is co-founder of the nonprofit Narrative, a leading digital publisher of fiction, poetry, and art, and Narrative in the Schools, which provides reading and writing resources to teachers and students around the world. Carol lives with her family in San Francisco, and she's here tonight to talk to us. Lacy, you got it? We're going to talk about Vera. You got the book? There it is. Such a great cover. Such a great book.
Beautiful cover.
Yeah, love it. We're gonna have to talk about that too. And holding up the book there is Lacy Crawford. Lacy is the author of fiction and nonfiction, including the satire Early Decision and the memoir Notes on a Silencing. Notes on a Silencing was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and Notable Book, as well as a Best Book of 2020 by Time, People, NPR, Book Page, Library Journal, and LitHub. Lacy's work has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Narrative, LitHub, and Vanity Fair. And her literary journalism includes interviews and profiles of Frank Conroy, Reynolds Price, Jeffrey Wolf, and Cheryl Hazard. She lives in California with her husband and her 3 children. So welcome, ladies. Have a great conversation. See you in about a half hour.
Thank you, Julie.
So I know that as Julie reads my bio, Carol, you're ticking off everything. You were there for every moment of that. So the story of how Carol and I know each other is a San Francisco story, and it's a good way to begin. I have lived in San Francisco twice in my life, each time for 2 years, each time in a house at the very top of a hill with a whole lot of people, some of whom I knew, some of whom I didn't really know. None of us could ever afford the house that we were living in at the time. And the first time I lived there was in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, right after college. with 2 college roommates, 2 other women, and a man on the top floor we found through back when they had free papers on, on Haight Street. He was looking for a place to live, and he and his pet rat moved in to the top floor. And all I wanted to do when I lived in San Francisco was write, which is all I want to do even now. And somehow or another, I knocked on your door where you live, there in the other side of town with Tom Jenks, both of you editors. And I think Rise the Euphrates, your debut had been out for a couple years at that point, in 96 that it was out. So your book and I were kind of newly launched in the world at the same time. And that began a long 25 years of friendship and mentorship. I was your student, and then I was invited to work with you on Narrative when you launched Narrative magazine, and it was under the auspices of your editing and Tom's editing that I was able to conduct all those interviews that are now proudly a part of my bio of Reynolds Price and Shirley Hazard, and to really get started in the way that I did. So I'm incredibly grateful to be in conversation with you about Vera, about this book, about San Francisco. The second time I lived in San Francisco for 2 years, I lived on the top of a different hill, or near the top of a different hill, on the other side of town entirely. And at the foot of that hill was a fire hydrant that was painted gold. And my neighbors explained to me that every year on April 18th, the neighborhood would gather and they would repaint this fire hydrant gold. And the reason they did this was because this was the first fire hydrant in the entire city to work following the quake. So the water mains were all cut, which is what led to the fires, as you'll explain. But this one remained, still had pressure, and it was the first one that did. It was up at the corner of 20th and Dolores, or 20th and Church, all the way up the hill. And so every year on April 18th, they repaint this fire hydrant. So the first year we were there, I went down with a small cluster of wonderful, eccentric San Francisco people on the hill, and the wind was howling and the fog was coming in, and you could hear the clanking and the bells and the horns and the birds and everything. And there are naked people in the park, and children walking to school, and they're repainting this fire hydrant, and they're talking about something as though it's over. And it was abundantly clear that nothing is over about San Francisco. Nothing is done. The past is not the past, right? In San Francisco, and the Apple bus and the Facebook bus and the Google bus were just beginning to run, at the foot of that very corner. And we were already on the rise of another precipice. And so when I read this book, I suppose we could say that it's historical fiction because it's set in 1906 when there's the great earthquake, but I do not feel in any way that to set it 100 years ago is to contain the story so much as it is to reveal a whole lot that's true about who we are now and who San Francisco is now. And I wondered if you could just tell us a bit about the city then and now, and what the earthquake meant and what happened.
Well, thank you. That was such a beautiful introduction. And I am so honored to be here with you. And for anyone who hasn't read Lacy's work and Lacy's profiles and narrative of some amazing writers, and her new book, Notes on a Silencing, essential reading and really important reading. So I bow to you. San Francisco in 1906 was still, I can see we have a visitor who's just,
she just opened the door.
Who's just arrived. That's Miss B. Rose. San Francisco in 1906 was very much a city that was just beginning to arrive, and very much a city of change. And if you go back to the real roots of this city, it's the miners, it's the gold rush miners. So it was really a place founded by entrepreneurial zeal, folks who'd come from literally all over the world to stake their claim and find their fortune. And that sense of can-do, rule-breaking, wild ambition and optimism. And on the other side of all that, a kind of hubris, a kind of, rules don't apply to us, and in fact, we make our rules day by day, and the search for luck, all part of the DNA of San Francisco, and also part of the DNA of San Francisco were, what sprung up to service the miners. Well, prostitution was one of the earliest industries in San Francisco and remains so when we get to 1906. The city certainly had, banking and a police force and all those things, but the basic DNA doesn't change of a place. And even now, I mean, I think we're seeing San Francisco today is very much that same kind of place, both for the light and the shadow that brings. But it was an interesting moment for the quake, also happening at the same time, and very much part of this novel is there was widespread political corruption in the city. The mayor, a very handsome fellow named Eugene Schmitz, had been a violinist. He was a musician, and he was put in the mayoral seat by a guy, Abe Roof, who really ran the town. He was a party boss, and Roof owned the sheriff. He owned all the board of supervisors, and indeed he owned the mayor. And in fact, on the morning of April 18th, Eugene Schmitz and Abe Ruff were about to be indicted for graft. And instead, at just a little after 5 a.m. In that morning, pre-dawn, the quake happened. And the thing about quakes that's so interesting is they're not just singular events. So there was the first quake, then it was quickly followed by another quake, and many, in fact, hundreds of aftershocks. But what happened, and to your point about the golden hydrant, and I love that story, is in the shaking, the water mains broke and the gas lines broke. And so fires erupted, and there wasn't water to put them out. So for the next 3 days, I mean, far more devastating than the quake were 3 days of fires. There were over 50 fires throughout the city. And by the end of, on the fourth day, what was left, 28,000 buildings, 500 city blocks were ashes.
Do we have any idea how many people died?
The official toll is 3,000 plus casualties, but everyone agrees.
Nowhere close to.
Nowhere close. I mean, and so there were so many bodies incinerated to the point where they weren't recovered. So there's not an accurate tell on that. I will say that over 250,000 people were homeless. I mean, think about that. And it's 1906, and there's no way to get water, or how do you quickly establish food lines? Something I'm seeing now and I'm really thinking about is sort of this rollout of the vaccine, and how many people, what kind of, calling on the National Guard, calling on the Army, just the legions it takes to set up tents, to set up everything. Now, transport that to 1906. And it was a stunning feat. I mean, naval ships came into the harbor, and a lot of the refugees were just simply taken.
They just removed them, because for people who haven't been to San Francisco or spent time there, it is a rocky promontory on the tip of a peninsula in the bay, and it feels precarious, and it is always gusty, and it is often cold, and the hills are not a joke. I mean, you cannot get up them some days, right? And horses cannot get up them, and cars cannot get up them some days. And so one of the things that I want to say about this book, which is it's a wonderful read. It is a deeply immersive, absorbing, wonderful read. And it is fun to read about a catastrophe that is not our current catastrophe. That feels nice. But it's a literary work, and if I can say this candidly, in which a lot happens. And I think lately, especially, and in books that I deeply love, there is a trend toward such interiority and character-driven or even tone-driven work, which is wonderful and deeply articulate and thoughtful. But it is such a sensory pleasure to read a book in which so much happens to so many people. And you've built the fiction of Vera on top of the nonfiction that you've just told us, the history of these very real personages, which for anyone who's read Doctorow will be a familiar technique, particularly with Ragtime, which I know you've talked about in other conversations about the book. But what I was struck by, and I wonder if you could detail, is those moments at 5 a.m. It's still dark. In April, it's cold. It's in the 40s, right, in the mornings in San Francisco, and houses have been flattened. And what happens then?
Well, imagine, and thank you for that, because I think for fiction to really work, it has to read as news of the day. It has to connect with our own urgency and those things we're living through now. But also, I really intended to write an adventure story about, yes, surviving a disaster, but also surviving life, and what resources, what kind of resilience we each can muster when called upon to sort of not just survive, but even thrive, and all those relationships that get kind of jiggered in that kind of event, which of course we're living in now. I think in writing what happened during the quake, I often think about, it's dark. You're awakened by this jolt. So of course the adrenaline, but you can't really see. You can't, one of the things about anybody who's lived through a quake, and I've been in the city long enough to have lived through Loma Prieta and some of the others, the noise is unbelievable.
It's a roar. It's a train.
It's a cacophony. It's,
Yes.
People describe it as a freight train coming under the house. It also, if you live in an old house, like the house does moan. The house, that wood really tries to bend. It tries to go back to being
There's a squeal too.
It's a squeal, and there's, the combustion of windows and plaster and animals out on the street. Of course, there were cars in 1906, but there were a ton of horses, and a lot of horses got crushed, and people. So all that's happening in the dark. And so imagine, you've got to find your shoes. You've got to, are you walking on glass? In a quake, a wood floor actually ripples and waves. I mean, all those kinds of things. And to get out, to get your people, to get out of the house. And there is that moment of stepping onto the street, and dawn is just coming on. So it's that filtered light. It's cold. Your house may have jumped off its foundation. Your house may have really fallen, and you're climbing your way out. You're stuck or not climbing your way out. Not everybody gets out. And there you are. If you're lucky enough to be out on the street, you may be wounded. And there is that moment when your neighbors, you all sort of are looking at each other, and another shaker comes on, and maybe another part of the house falls down. And maybe you figure out, I'm going to take the risk of running in and getting a few things. What do you grab? I mean, one of the things that I'm so interested in writing in terms of story is despite our intentions, we're often foolish. We often make mistakes. And how does that play out in a drama? So that's happening. And then you're standing in the street, and just over one of the hills, you see the first puffs of smoke. And as you're standing there, the smoke is billowing, and it's getting darker and darker. And one of the things about living in this city of hills is you just don't know what's happening over the other hill.
So there's no visibility in San Francisco. I mean, if you're at the tippy top of a hill, you can see the fronts of the hills you can see, right? But there is no, right. I grew up in the Midwest, and it was completely foreign to me and remains foreign.
Yeah. So that's all happening. And then of course, there are the days that follow. And, the early part of Vera really sets up this world of San Francisco, and Vera's world. And I should say Vera is a 15-year-old girl who um, who is the daughter of one of the most successful madams um, in town.
And is
And
Rose based on a real character? Was there a Rose?
there wasn't specifically a Rose. Vera's mother is Rose of the Rose.
She's a power broker.
She's a power
She's
broker.
completely in control and respected by all the men in the city.
Right. And she knows everybody's secrets. And she also is has her hand in the till. And instead of raising her daughter, she has put Vera, really bought Vera a life and has put her with a widow named Maury Johnson, who is as different from Rose as one can be. And Maury has a daughter, Pie, and this is Vera's foster family. Maury also has a bit of a drinking problem and a gambling problem. So all of this is up when the book begins. And Vera was a really fun character for me to write because unlike her sister Pie, who is lovely and whose sort of goal in life is to marry well and live a very conventional life, Vera is contrary by nature. And life has kind of handed her a contrary bag. She is housed, but in a sense, unmoored. She doesn't belong to anybody. And she is unloved. And she is smart and scrappy and capable in an era when young women weren't supposed to be that way. And so she longs to live she longs to be with her real mother, Rose. And that longing hits its own moment of drama in the quake and what follows with the quake.
So I wanted to ask about that longing. A 15-year-old girl is a figure that I spent some time thinking about.
Yeah.
It's a critical axis, I think, in a young woman's life. All that wanting, so much wanting, and just leaving childhood and not yet available to anything of womanhood, and certainly not in 1906. And Vera longs for her mom. This is a book in which a lot of people lose a lot of things. People die. Spoiler, people die. That you just kill them. It happens. I thought there's no way, nobody dies really in contemporary fiction anymore, but in Vera that happens. And animals too. There's a lot of loss. And Vera, who is telling us the story, we eventually find out is a very, very old woman. She does not shy away from describing any of those losses except for one. And that is the initial wound, that is the initial loss. And that is that so she spent the first almost 2 years of her life being cared for by the prostitutes at Rose's Rose, which is the pinnacle, right, institution in the city, which is where all the men who can afford it go to be cared for in whatever fetishy way they wish to be cared for. And there's a little girl running up and down the halls and asking questions. And when she gets old enough to start asking why and to be problematic, Rose, for reasons either of good intentions or exhaustion or ignorance or who knows, decides that she's going to send her little girl to be raised by Maury, by the cold Swedes, and she'll have an older sister and she'll be paid for, and that will be that. And there's a description that Vera has to imagine, of course, but she describes for us the entire scene of Rose visiting with Sugar, who's the old harlot who's taken care of this little girl, and meeting Maury and meeting Piper, the sister, the girl who's what is she, 5 or something in that, right? And saying, Piper, take her up to your room. And what Vera tells us, which as a mom makes me cry, as a girl makes me cry, what I have to imagine is what happened when I came back downstairs and they were gone. Rose and Sugar were gone. So the only adults she'd ever known until the age of 2 vanished, and she didn't see them again, except for when Rose sends for her. So yeah, earthquake, schmirthquake, there's a catastrophic seismic thing, but our girl has already lost, the earth has already shaken for her. And for me, the story is, can she get that back? Can that be recovered? And is it going to be recovered by her mom Does she get to Rose, who we know not only has her establishment downtown, but has the house on the top of the hill? Or does she find it through a sister, a lover, husbands, children? Is she going to get that back? And I don't want to give away the answer, but there are moments where Rose has the chance and Rose doesn't. And I wondered if you knew when you started writing how mother and daughter would end, or did you have to write your way there?
That's a really interesting question. Let me say a couple of things, because as usual, you're so smart in the reading, and you have such an interesting take on the reading. It's something to write a book, and then it gets into readers' hands and it becomes theirs, and it's a beautiful alchemy. I don't think the book is really about, in so many ways, what Vera finds, what she gains. And I don't think we really feel an appreciation for what we have until something gets taken away, and until we get the opposite. And there's early on in the book, there's a line from Vera's point of view where she says, all of my life, I've been looking for one adult who can teach me how to behave. And she doesn't ever find that adult. She has to become that adult. And of course, early in the book, it's her birthday where the book begins, and she's 15. And I should say, not only does she not live with her mother, but her mother only will agree to see her 3 times a year. And one of those days is her birthday. So we get to see that moment when she sees Rose, and it's never what she hopes for, because what she hopes for is to be loved, and that is not something in Rose's toolbox. Rose has not gotten to the point, to the pinnacle, without being kind of a tough customer. The mother-daughter relationship between Rose and Vera evolved for me. I always start with an idea of where I'm going. Lots of ideas. And there are so many characters in this book, and all of them want things, and some of them get what they want. Most of them get something that they didn't know they wanted. But in the case of Rose and Vera, I had a sense of what was possible for them. But as I wrote and revised and revised and revised, as they became more complex, and frankly, as they experienced more, as I kept throwing things at them and seeing how they would turn or not turn toward one another, it became clear what their destiny was. And the thing about those moments, I think about the word grace a lot when I'm writing, and those moments, and what I mean by grace is like those moments of connection when characters are able to sort of let down their swords or pride or misconceptions, and they can just connect. And they're always in some way or another driving toward that, and they don't often get it. And as much as we want them to get it, it's really fulfilling to see them miss, because it reminds us of our own lives. It touches on a place inside all of our hearts that yearn for something. And yet when they do get it, it feels earned. So Rose and Vera have a lot of chances in this novel.
Rose is an immigrant. Everybody, I was struck reading this. These are partisan times, and I think it's difficult to read fiction or nonfiction without the lens of our current political discourse. And I thought very much that this was a San Francisco book. I didn't think, America. I thought a fresh city that is gaping and wild and full of orphans. And Rose is an immigrant, we suspect, via Mexico City, but she won't really tell us. And she possibly has some Middle Eastern heritage or Armenian heritage or European heritage. And of course, her daughter is darker skinned than she's supposed to be living with the Swedish widow whose husband
Yeah.
Lars has been gone for a long time. And then there is this extraordinary 3-generational family of Chinese immigrants who are relatively new to the city. I don't know how long Tan has been there, but in his daughter, Li Fang, I don't know if she was born there or not. What was striking to me is there is no effort at all that you make to flatten anybody, to make their experiences recognizable to each other. They're recognizable to the reader because you've done that work. But these people are jostled up against each other and they have no idea how this is supposed to be. And there is no discourse of immigration or American democracy or voters' rights or any of that. I mean, some of it is historically premature and some of it is simply irrelevant because everybody's trying to figure out, whose dog they can eat for dinner, right? I mean, it's a rough time. The character Tan, who is Rose's, I mean, what's the term for it? He's a kind of servant.
Well, he's her major domo. He's her chef. He's her butler. He's
the silent, sort of almost like Ishiguro figure, who serves Rose's needs, is at first a rival and becomes a much more complex figure in Vera's life and in the book. And I wonder, I would love to hear about the evolution of Tan and his daughter Li Fang, who scares me to death, and all of the way that you held all of the different spaces that these different characters showed up holding.
Well, it occurs to me to say that everyone in the novel is a thief. Everyone in the novel, including Vera. And one of the things I was looking at in this adventure story was what the turning the notion of honor among thieves on its head. What is honor ultimately when everybody's a thief? And in thinking about Tan, who really for me was the greatest surprise in writing the book, because he just gained he demanded more space just by his capability, his inherent dignity, his sense of family that Vera doesn't have. And Vera really learns a lot from Tan. But where they begin is they really can't stand each other. Tan is Rose's major domo. He is a man of incredible knowledge, elegance, who has fought his way to this place in a grand house. Yet he is a Chinese man in 1906, and therefore, as a servant, he lives in the basement of the house on a dirt floor with broken furniture and a slop jar. So every day he goes upstairs in this starched uniform to wait on Rose and Rose's people, and every night he has to descend. And the unfairness of that, and what he has to do to provide for his daughter and father who live in Chinatown, puts him on the edge well before the quake. What he also has to do is once a week go down to Vera's house and take care of these people who don't know how to keep house, don't know how to cook, and he thinks of Vera as just a pain in the butt. She is a wrinkle in his otherwise fairly seamless life. And she's contrary. So she goes up against Tan early on and they spar. And then what happens in the quake is, bit by bit, they come to recognize each other's both capabilities and in that testing. And I think that's something that perhaps I'm hearing from some readers really resonates with today, is you don't really know who you are until you're tested. And you don't, if society is flattened in the way that it was with the quake, and you're standing in food lines, matrons who live in the grand houses of Pacific Heights are standing next to refugees who don't even don't have a tent, don't have a cup. Everyone is on their edge, but also society is for a moment flattened. And there's the possibility for those who have been marginalized, who have been overlooked, women, immigrants. There's a moment where if there is possibility to reinvent. There's a line in the book: catastrophe for many is an opportunity for some. And Tan and Vera are very much two people who seize the opportunity and in fact form a partnership that, without giving away too much in the book, becomes very lasting and very true. But that's not to say there are a lot of moments in between where they are really worthy rivals.
I mean, it does seem that there are sort of two systems of morality at play when in the San Francisco before the quake, as the book describes it. So there is what I recognize to be a very brittle, sort of wealthy white bourgeois morality, which is the Pack Heights matrons, and
Right.
at the top of that are, Spreckles, the Sugar King, and the other folks who Crocker and I don't their names, they're in the book, who have the mansions that still sit, on the top of these hills. And are they occupied now? Are they museums? Are they cathedrals? I don't know, but they're still there. And then there is, and you recognize right away that what they have is thin as lace and is not going to be sustainable after the quake. That is rent almost immediately, and that is the world to which Vera's sister or foster sister Pi aspires. Right, this is the world that she longs to be a part of. And there's a very interesting figure, Alma de Bretteville, who gets to sort of shimmer, kind of, I think, in between the two of them. But then there is I wouldn't even call it the underworld, because it seems sort of ascendant in San Francisco at that time, which is the gangsters and the prostitutes and the politicians on the take. And they have their own morality and they have their own system, which is no worse, and no better than, what the Pacific Heights ladies are up to. And watching those two things crumble, I sort of felt that it was a bit of a race to see if Vera and Tan and the others who have been subjugated on all sides, who are orphans, they're all orphans really, could establish something of themselves, a toehold. And there's an amazing parallel between the work they're doing and trying to establish actual toeholds in the world, literally going in the pantry, cleaning the glass off the floor and saying, we have 6 eggs and 2 jars of beans. And that is literally what we have. And I think we're just close enough to that fantasy of panic as a result of the pandemic, to those of us who have been privileged to ride it out with plenty, to think, my God, everything that I feel embedded in would be gone. Right? So as you were writing it, did you know who would rise? Did you know?
I have an inkling, but often I think so much of, for me, writing is writing toward opportunity and surprises. So as characters become more multifaceted, and no one in the book rides in on the white horse wearing the white hat. We're all complex beings. We're all combinations of ambition and hope and heart and folly and, fill in the blanks. And my job as a writer is to show as many dimensions of a character as I can. And I feel I'm successful if as a reader you attach to each of the characters in some way, or at least understand how they got made, how they are who they are, to show them in their wrong rightness. And one of the things about a disaster, a catastrophe, is everyone reveals themselves. For better or worse, when put on the edge, you reveal yourself, you reveal what you're really made of. And in that, there's what you know about yourself, and there's ways in which you surprise yourself. I mean, I think all of us, having gone through the last year, have seen sides of ourselves and the people we care about that are new, because because we've had to summon new things. And it becomes very elemental really quickly. You know, how many eggs do you have? Do you have boots so that you can walk through the rubble? Do you have Pi, Vera's sister, in the smoke, can't breathe? So she very quickly gets weakened. And what does that look like when her sister is therefore forced to take care of everyone? Her little sister, the 15-year-old Vera, has to be the one who summons it all to take care of this increasing family of orphans, as you put it. And I think so much, I guess I'm always writing stories that have some kind of, that find a moment that's politically charged, that touches upon a moment of crisis in society where there's real societal change. And then, these characters who are, who whether they want to or not, are being tasked with reinvention. And I find that really interesting in terms of drama and surprise. What you were saying, I don't know everything when I start out. I wouldn't want to know. I want to open it up enough and challenge characters and myself enough to be surprised and to have to grow.
What I felt you doing, maybe even working against, Julie, I got to ask this one.
Oh yeah, no, go.
As I read this book, I thought a lot about Station 11, about Emily St. John Mandel's book. For this reason, it is a dystopian setup that we start with, right? Something catastrophic has happened and everything that we've relied on is gone. But despair does not get a seat at this table. So it is either urgency, which is we must figure out how we are going to feed ourselves. We must figure out how to start a fire to keep warm without burning our own house down. We must make sure that this alcove does not collapse on us while we're in our bed. But at the same time, there's a cute boy who's sleeping in the stable and I'm 15, and at the same time, my mom is out there and I don't know if she's alive. And at the same time, Tan is driving me mad and his daughter I can't stand. And none of that goes away. Right? All of these things that we might imagine we would be purified of, petty longings or deep longings that would go away in the event of survival, that doesn't happen at all. They just get bumped up a notch, because you also need to feed yourself. And I was so moved by that, by how their hearts got even bigger when everything else went away, as sort of a flat city round character set up. And it makes it impossible to stop reading because you're tracking all of this with them. And Vera survives because she's telling you the story, but there are no guarantees about anybody else. And that's an unusual feeling to have in a novel, and it's exhilarating.
Oh, thank you, Lace.
Yeah. Not to put a pun in there, but she shakes the ground under your feet when you're reading it.
It's
because
spooky.
you don't know.
And you're still in San Francisco. I was
right.
Like, you gotta rethink about that. I don't know if you have putty under the picture frames I'm seeing on the bookcases behind you.
I have a stock of water at all times.
Everything is glued down. Yeah.
Cans of stuff.
Yeah. If a little dog starts to whine, get out of Dodge would be the
Anyway. I didn't mean to cut you off, Lacy, but we got lots of good questions coming in, so I wanted to make sure. And Arlene, hello, Arlene out there. You always have wonderful questions for us. So she's got quite a few. So I'm going to start with them. I'll start with one and keep going. So these are all from Arlene. So how deeply, Carol, do you inhabit your characters and the time period? Does it make it hard to reorient yourself back to the present day reality?
That's a great question. I love to do research. The Curious George aspect of being a writer is one of my favorite parts. And I think why in a way I do what I do, because I want to learn stuff. So in this book, I spent almost 2 years researching it and really getting steep. There are amazing firsthand accounts of the time and the quake, pre and post, and even as it was happening. So I get really saturated with that stuff. And while I'm digging, I'm drafting and I'm thinking of what's the fictional world is I'm going to put on top of, and what of the real world I'm going to keep. And in the drafting, I'm kind of in and out of the book, but there comes a moment in the revising, and I revise many times, where actually the world on the page feels a little more real than my life. I remember when my youngest daughter, I have 3 daughters, and my youngest daughter, one time I came down to dinner and we were all chatting, and she said, "Oh, you have that look." And I said, "What does that mean?" And she said, "Mama, you're still in the book." And I realized, wow, okay. But I think it's sometimes hard to shift.
Right. Because they're inhabiting your brain. I mean,
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
there.
you
They're
gotta,
you're
you
live.
kind of got to hold them all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so another part of her question is, how does it feel when you know that you have reached the end of a book or story?
Mm.
Or do you have I mean, do you know when you're end?
You think you're done and you're not quite done, is my experience. And sometimes the feeling of being done is fatigue, profound fatigue, and you need it to get cold for a little while and then go back in. But when it's really done, you know it's done. And there is a feeling, there's a feeling of loss, actually, because people talk about publishing as like the laurel, the joy, but actually the real joy, if you're a crazy writer, is those moments in your room when you're with those characters and you couldn't figure out that scene, and they're wanting the various things they're wanting, and then suddenly it clicks into place, and you can feel that. So to lose them, to not be in conversation with them, there's a bit of loss. And these guys, I mean, they were just so full of beans all the way till the end. And
Yeah.
Vera, that it is a romp, it is an adventure, and it's fun to talk about them because I miss them.
Do you have a ritual or routine when you write, and has that changed during the pandemic?
Do I have a ritual or routine? I am always, I'm always fighting to have more time to get to the page. And I often begin the day of writing with reading poetry to get language flowing into my head. So that's a ritual. Or I will just read a scene of something just to feel the movement, or I'll go back to an earlier pages in the work that I'm currently fussing with, and try to find solid ground.
And did the pandemic make it where you had more time to write, or not as much time, or was it about the same?
That's an interesting question. I've been this last year, between everything in the news and the election and the pandemic. I don't know. I've been talking, and Lacy, I don't know if you've felt this, but it's just on top of life and family and work and writing and all of those things, there's been so much to occupy one's brain, that the worry, the constant anxiety, the feeling of despair of what's so many people lost in this last year. There has been a lot of shelf space. So I think I've been much less productive than I would like.
Well, there's also that latency period when a book is sold and then the author is waiting for the book to come out, and there is so much pre-pub work, if you're lucky, that you do, that is sort of the opposite of the writing of the book or even the editing of the book. And I think it's almost impossible to do both. Maybe you can start something new. I know there are writers who start something new the day they sell something, but I have to get dormant in some kind of weird, fussy, annoyed way.
And most authors that we've talked to, I mean, we've been hosting a lot of authors last year. Carol, everybody feels about the same. It's just this, that your brain, it's just, there was this like fog.
Yeah.
It was never really, we never really had clarity in anything. It was hard to focus. And the last part of Arlene's question, and then we've got a couple more. from other viewers. Did you have a favorite research material or reference when you wrote this book?
Mm.
You know, the photographs of the time were my touchstone. You know, there's a series of photographs. A couple of the great photographers actually grabbed their cameras and took pictures throughout the day of the quake.
Mm.
And I was so struck by some of these photos of folks, you know, with whatever they'd grabbed, you know, whether it was a trunk or a suitcase, or a lot of people grabbed rugs, you know, they'd rolled rugs.
Interesting.
And you would see these photographs of people, you know, pulling on carts or just pulling a trunk down the street. But they would get to high ground, which made sense, whether it was a park or whatever, and they'd pause. And some of them were sort of, you know, eating what food they had or whatever, but they kind of looked a little celebratory. And behind them was these incredible flames and smoke. And you'd think, why are you running? I mean, the smoke, you know, this fire is 10 blocks away from you. But I think they were so shocked, and I think they were exhausted. And maybe that very human quality of disbelief, like, you know, surely the fire can't get to us. I mean, we made it through the quake. I don't know, but it was so interesting. I mean, women who had grabbed their hats and were wearing these hats, and they're standing on the hill smiling for the camera, and behind them, here comes real devastation. And just that human quality of like, how much can we hold in a moment, you know? And what I love, and I hope this comes through in the book, is I love the pull toward life. You know, no matter what happens, we're always rooting for life. And that's true of those photographs. So I kept going back and back because I kept thinking, who are they? And what are they? What's moving through them?
Right. And the fact that they, like you said, that the photographers had the cameras and the wherewithal to take those pictures,
Yeah.
and then they survived through the fires, through all of that.
Yep.
Is amazing. Thank you, Arlene, as always. And then Sarah has a question. How much time did you spend on research versus how much time on the actual writing for this novel?
I really began the book toward the end of 2014 in terms of research. And so 2015, 2016, I was really just sort of, you know, like a dog circling and circling, tamping down the grass, figuring out how wide the circle would be. And drafting, but really like trying to figure, it was a very big world. And the deeper I went in the research, I felt like I could have written 20 books about all these characters and, you know, the political, the trial of Schmitz and Roof and where they end up and all that stuff that I didn't know about. So I had to figure out where my coordinates were in terms of Vera and this girl and her voice and her story that I so much wanted to tell. And everything that was going on at that time, as we were ramping up to the 2016 election and feeling that in many ways our society was in a precarious state. And so what happened in 1906 felt relevant and felt urgent to me. And the deeper and deeper I went into the writing, finished the book and handed in the final revision in January of 2020. And of course, we didn't know about the pandemic then. So who knew what mix would have transpired when the book would actually get read.
Right.
And we would have gone through this last year.
Amazing. We didn't get a chance to really talk about the cover, and I know that authors don't really have a lot to do with the cover, but they did a great job with the cover.
I actually had a lot to do with it.
Did you? Oh, okay. Because sometimes authors don't. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, and bless Scribner, they were really open to my suggestions. And
it's gorgeous. This is also what the movie poster will be. I'm betting that now. You can come back to me when I'm right.
It's a great cover. And speaking of Scribner, thank you to them for allowing us to host. We're pretty much out of time now. Carol, Lacy, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Lacy, for people who are out there and want to follow you, you're pretty active on Twitter.
Yeah, it's the only one I can figure out. I'm just terrible on Facebook and Instagram. I don't know how to log into Instagram right now. So Twitter, Lacy_Crawford. You can find me there.
Perfect.
Always.
And then Carol, do you have a website you want to direct people to, or do you just like to do Instagram? Or
CarolEdgarian.com is a website, and I'm on Twitter at Carol Edgarian, and I'm most active on Instagram, C Edgarian. And I would just say also check out narrativemagazine.com, something that Lacy, it wouldn't exist without Lacy.
And you can read a bit. You can read a bit of this book on.
oh, there's little samples in there, huh?
Right. And we have a free library of thousands of stories and poems. So dive in.
Fantastic.
And
Ladies, thank you. This
you.
was a wonderful evening. I'm going to say goodbye to Facebook. So thank you, everybody. Again, if you joined us late, come back here to watch the beginning, and more fun things at Warwick's. Check us out at warwicks.com. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.